people from Sydney joining us tonight, but we've still got Melbourne in lockdown. And even if you're not in lockdown, obviously these are a great thing to get to hear from some great photographers around Australia. And today's definitely one of those. Now, before we get kicked off, I just want to let you know we've got a 15% off discount for anyone that's joining us tonight. So the code is very easy, live 15 Dylan. So if you wanted to get 15% off any products, including the new V7, maybe our Star soft filter, jump on until the 24th. Now, tonight, we are going to be lucky enough to hear from Dylan. And if you don't know, Dylan is 50% of Everlook Photography. You may follow Everlook Photography on Instagram or Facebook. Dylan is the man behind that. And Marianne is his wife. Yeah, who's the other 50%. And she's an amazing photographer as well. And obviously, a lot of businesses and ventures, it takes a lot of work, and it takes more than one person sometimes, and we see a lot in this industry. It is a partnership, so it's wonderful to see Dylan and his wife work on this project together. Now, Dylan is one of, I believe, Australia's best photographers. He has got an amazing portfolio of work. His work is just so inspiring for me as a photographer, and I know so many other photographers that look up to Dylan and look up to the amazing work that he creates. He has traveled to some amazing places, and you can see in his shots the effort that is put in to get those shots, the effort that's put in to get there at that perfect time. And you'll definitely see, I'm sure, some of the crazy places he's had to go, and the crazy trails and the crazy hikes, just to get to some of the waterfalls that he's going to show us tonight. And I know Dylan does it a lot with his kids as well, which is amazing to be able to take them along for the ride. So yeah, I hope you really enjoy tonight. And thank you so much, Dylan, for doing this and presenting tonight. I'm personally very much looking forward to it. So I might pass it over to you, Dylan.
Yeah, no problems. Thanks very much for the generous introduction, and thanks also to everyone for showing up. I hope to take you on a little bit of an adventure tonight, particularly if you're in lockdown, just to get away from it all a bit. So I'll just share screen and we'll get going. All right, so hopefully that's showing up on people's screens.
Yep.
All right, so tonight what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about planning an adventure to take your waterfall pictures, and also how you go about taking them, and then maybe at the end just a little bit about the principles of post-processing without actually showing too much of that. I'm going to be showing some videos and a lot of pictures, and at any step along the way, if you're not sure about why I did something or want some more explanation about the picture, by all means go ahead and ask, and Andrew can stop me and I'll try and answer the question. So with waterfalls, the good thing about them is that some are very easily accessible by the roadside, some of them take a lot of planning, and some of them aren't really even named. So you could really take your pick as to what type of adventure you want to do. Generally speaking, the rule of thumb for waterfall photography is that you like to have overcast conditions, but I like to be prepared for all kinds of conditions. And sometimes when it's very bright light, you can actually get a more compelling dramatic image from that. Or if it's raining terribly or something like that, you might get horizontal drops of rain coming across the picture. That makes it really interesting as well. So don't let the conditions phase you. You just need to be prepared so that you can get through them and your camera can get through them as well. So in terms of what conditions I look for, coming from a very dry state like SA, I really need to watch for at least kind of 10 to 20 mils having flown, dropped in the last week or so. Otherwise, they just won't be flowing. But obviously in the eastern states and other places, the waterfalls will always be flowing. It's just how they look. And sometimes there's too much flow. if you do decide to go on a waterfall adventure to an off the beaten track, it's very important to stay safe and know where you're going, not get lost, and have backup plans and so forth. So I'll talk a little bit about the more adventure side of photography. And overall, I think the most important thing about waterfall photography for me is that you're usually going in somewhere that's really nice environment. So if you go in with the attitude that you're just going to enjoy the walk and the photography is a good side product of it, then it's going to be a win-win situation for you no matter what you do. So the four things that I prepare for in terms of barriers to shooting are wind, because it's going to make shooting of foliage quite difficult, sun because of dynamic range, and spray and rain getting clean images makes it a challenge as well. So I'll talk a bit to you about some of my strategies about getting those. And sometimes getting shots may not necessarily be possible. So this walk here, that's my 10-year-old daughter, Charlotte. She's walking through the Montezuma Track Falls walk. And the suspension bridge was closed, so we couldn't go up there. And it was raining all day. So we were expecting some heavy flow, and we would have loved to shoot the waterfall, but this is the approach to the waterfall. And we basically walked 10 Ks to a destination that looked like this.
Don't go out there. Oh, wow.
So you really need an underwater housing to take a picture like that. So I still remember getting very wet after that, not recovering for the rest of the walk. So yeah, that was one where we did not come back with a single waterfall shot. As opposed to something like this. This is a picture of Challen Falls taken on the Tulona Creek circuit in Queensland. And this was part of a 17K walk. So I did that solo because I didn't think the kids would be able to handle it, and started at about 4 o'clock in the morning to try and get to a position to take some pictures at dawn. So this is a picture of O'Reilly's rainforest retreat. And basically I walked in the dark all the way out along this border track. And over here, you're looking over an escarpment into New South Wales. And so dawn light comes and really lights things up nicely. So to get there by dawn, gave myself about an hour and a half. And then after the dawn, walk backwards, shooting from the upstream smaller falls all the way down Tulona Creek to the main falls. Elabana might be the one that you've heard of, before heading back and joining the family for lunch. So that kind of track isn't one that's particularly challenging in terms of wayfinding. So you don't really need apps to get you through that one. It's just more a question of time. And, once you're 10 Ks out, you've got to go 10 Ks back. So having the endurance and the training to be able to do that's important. So gear tips before we start looking at more pictures. These days, even mobile phones can take decent shots of cameras if you can put them on tripods and set it to long exposure mode, but I don't tend to do that. So I won't talk anything about mobile photography for waterfalls. Tripods are clearly highly desirable because you're taking long exposures a lot of time to slow the shutter speed of the water to make it look smooth. But having said that, I've just recently joined the mirrorless brigade, and I'm on the Canon R5 at the moment, and it's got amazing image stabilization, particularly when paired with the new Canon 14-35. So with that lens, I'm comfortably able to take shots that are 0.4, 0.5 seconds. And often that's enough to get a good kind of blurring of water motion, yet retain some texture. So for a lot of people, that's actually a desired speed, shutter speed.
About that, yeah.
Hello? Was that a question? Oh, just background noise. All right. But unfortunately, I thought I might put this to a lot more use than I actually did in the last trip, because in a dark forest, to get half a second shutter speed with the required depth of field, you still need to jack the ISO up quite a bit. So I ended up taking several second exposures, which I obviously can't handhold. The other main photographic bit of gear, and if you were to just travel really light on these waterfall adventures, I just take one lens, one CPL, some cleaning equipment and a tripod, and that's probably about it. Because even the next one, a cable release or remote shutter, I don't find completely necessary because, for instance, the R5 has a really responsive touchscreen, so I barely need to touch it. So there's actually no risk of camera shake. And I can even do bulb exposures like that as well. So I actually don't carry a cable release anymore. It's just one more thing to get wet, one more thing to possibly drop off, and one more portal for water to get into the camera. Now, in terms of cleaning gear, I tend to use Kim wipes, which are a paper thing that's used for cleaning medical surfaces. And the advantage of using Kim wipes is that even when they're wet and you use them to wipe the lens or filters and so forth, they don't tend to leave smear marks rather than microfiber towels. So that's my main go-to. And I usually bring a big wad of them for any waterfall adventure. And lastly, for camera protection, you can get as complex as you want for this, but for the last trip, for instance, in the R5, it's pretty well weather sealed. So the most I used for water protection was draping a t-shirt over the camera. There are all sorts of other fancy ones that you can use. And when I was shooting with the A7R2, for instance, that wasn't very weather sealed. So I had to use more foolproof plastic waterproof covers for that. So just to break it up with an image, this is one of our first waterfall images that Marianne took from Iceland in 2010. It's Godafoss, which is now very well photographed. And the interesting thing about this one was it was taken with a screw-on ND filter, a 9-stop, and we actually didn't use a GND for this. We used a black card technique. So instead of actually using a filter, we just hold a opaque card over the top part of the image for half the exposure and then gradually lift it off, and basically that simulates a GND. So at that time we were doing that kind of thing, but that's very much a guesstimate as to how much light you block. So I wouldn't recommend it, but it's definitely fun to try in the field. And that shutter speed was well over a minute. So in terms of non-photographic gear tips, I'll just leave this video running in the background, but basically I get cold very easily because I'm not very heavily built. And so I need to make sure I'm very warm, because if I'm shivering, I just can't take any pictures, and I particularly can't take any handheld pictures. So this setup here is basically what I wear out. So waterproof outers, like maybe a Pertex Gore-Tex, and underneath that, I've got some waterproof waders with neoprene boots. And neoprene boots are good because they have some traction on wet rock, much more than gumboot versions of waders and much more than hiking boots. So I'll just pause that video there. In terms of good boots, I think the main thing I look for in boots these days is comfort, because even though boots sell themselves as waterproof, any waterproof boot I've bought has eventually gotten wet. And particularly when you're walking into streams, there's nothing to stop water coming in over the top. So I don't get too fussed about how waterproof a boot is. It's just got to be comfortable, and I've got to be comfortable walking it even when it's wet. The last question about mini spikes, they're like mini crampons. They can be a bit controversial because when you're wearing them, they do raise you a bit. So if you're a person that has their center of gravity affected quite a bit and your balance is off, they're probably not a good idea, because you will feel a little bit naturally unstable until you're used to them. And it doesn't guarantee that you're going to get traction of whatever you're standing on. So mini spikes are something to consider because they do give you more traction, but also look after the environment when you're using them. Take them off when you start walking in the forest again, otherwise they could scuff up the ground quite a bit as well. And the last bit of thing that I want to talk about briefly is wayfinding equipment. So if I'm going on a adventure to a more remote waterfall, as a backup, I have a paper map of the place I'm going as well as a compass. But the main thing I'm using at the moment is my phone with some kind of GPS app, which I'll talk about in a second. So this is a picture of the Lower Chasm Falls that I took from standing in the middle of the stream. It's a single exposure of about 1 second duration, taken on a tripod, obviously. And look, not every shot looks better from the middle of the stream, but if you're wearing waders, it at least gives you the option of standing in the middle of the stream without kind of freezing for the rest of the trip if you've got kind of wet pants and so forth. Just to demonstrate a few things, this is a lower res image. It's a picture of Abiqua Falls from Oregon, taken in 2013. And a couple of things there. I had taken this shot after quite a bit of shooting already. and it was in foggy, misty conditions. And by the time I found this vantage point, my cleaning gear was kind of saturated. And so I couldn't really get a clean shot on the lens because I was just wiping water onto water. So one of the tips for waterfall adventures is, if you have the opportunity with a clean lens to start off with, try and take some insurance shots, I guess, some shots at the start that you know you're going to be reasonably happy with before you get too adventurous and go into the middle of the spray, for instance, because once your equipment's wet, you might not be able to take any clean images after that, depending on how wet you get. So I tend to start off taking a few kind of safe pictures from not where near the sprays, and then kind of get a bit more daring and venture into areas that might be a bit more challenging to go. This is a picture of Waterfalls from Tassie, taken in 2011. It's one of my favorite waterfall shots, but you can see at the top, you may be able to see, there's a bit of smearing going on there as well. So I probably didn't have the appropriate cleaning equipment with me. And one lesson about this one is I wasn't using waders back then, and I wasn't using mini spikes, and bare feet has a bit more traction than boots, and I would not advise going bare feet into places like this, not only for cutting your feet, but the many leeches that ended up on my feet afterward from this shoot. So definitely waders is a better option. Spikes are a possibility. Bare feet is not advisable. So useful apps. In terms of planning your waterfall, as I said, your waterfall adventure, cloudy skies are usually good. Looking at previous rainfall is good to see what you're coming into, and seeing if there is rain coming in, so you dress appropriately for that. But I find that for shooting waterfalls, it's more about the adventure, and I'm going to venture it into the conditions no matter what the weather's doing and so forth. And I'll just try and cope with whatever the waterfall gives me or doesn't give me. It's not as crucial for waterfalls, I find, to plan, like say for a seascape, where the direction of light hitting the waves or hitting sea stacks and things is very important in terms of what you shoot, unless you're shooting an open air waterfall. And I've got a couple of examples of that, but for the most part, when you're in a forest, using light planning apps like PhotoPills aren't as crucial as other genres of photography. What I think is crucial though is using GPS and wayfinding equipment. So I use View Ranger, and the advantage about using something like View Ranger and Avenza is that you can download maps so that you don't need a connection for the map to constantly update. And so you can plan your route in advance, and you can see whether you're straying off route. And sometimes when you're in a difficult path like the Bastion Cascades Trail at the bottom here, I'll just leave that running, where the path isn't very clear. If you're straying off and you don't have a GPS app to warn you, it may be a long way off track you get before you find out you're on the wrong track. So it's a good time saver, and on the last trip it saved me a lot of time. For instance, this little bit here, Nick Monk warned me that you might end up going down the wrong path, and we did, down the path you see in the distance there, before we realized you had to climb this little rock wall here. So know how to use them as well, and also have a paper backup and a compass as well. And wherever you're going, there's going to be specific resources for researching the area you're going to. For instance, for Tasmania, there's Waterfalls of Tasmania have a book as well as a YouTube channel and a website that really details a lot of the route finding that you're going to have. And it also kind of gives you an expectation of what you're going to see. And I also wander into bookstores. So when I dropped into Hobart, one of my first stops is Salamanca and the Wild Earth Gallery there. And I always go there for a dose of inspiration, even if I don't find anything new. So utilize what you can to plan your adventure, and you'll get the most out of it and won't come across any nasty surprises, hopefully. This track I'm playing here is from the Bastion Cascades Trail. So if you're interested in doing that, that's a very fun hike through some amazing lush forestry. All right, so in terms of lighting tips, the video I've got down there is of Marriotts Falls in Tasmania, and that probably presents most of the conditions that make it difficult to get a good waterfall shot. So you've got bright sunlight, you've got wind, you've got spray. The only thing that wasn't there was rain on top of that. So for that one, you just got to have the right equipment and the right mindset to be able to take a shot of that kind of scene. So I'll talk about how I shoot that kind of scene as we go along. But I find that dynamic lighting situations are now my preference for shooting waterfalls. Clearly, if there's an overcast day, I'll still enjoy it, but you get some really dramatic light if there is some sunlight around, particularly if there's mist coming off the waterfall or if there's ambient mist in the air as well. One thing I'll mention quite a bit during this talk as well is the concept of ISO bracketing. Most of the time when we think about bracketing exposures, we adjust the shutter speed, but when you've got water movement, for instance, if you're doing 3 stops, a quarter of a second water movement looks quite different to 2 seconds. So if you're trying to blend that into your images, you may come across some unnatural looking blends depending on what you're doing. So I tend to shoot at a consistent shutter speed and say shoot at ISO 50, 100, 200, 400. And that's my bracketing rather than using the shutter speed as the bracketing option. So now some examples. This is Horseshoe Falls, a shot that I took in, I think, 2016. By that stage, my 16 to 35 had been saturated when I tried to get too close to Russell Falls. So I couldn't actually use that anymore because it was just fogging up. So I took a panorama with the 24 to 70, which is a more difficult way to get this kind of shot. And I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact one of the dangers with long exposures for waterfall photography is with the wind, there's moving foliage. And so that may be a desired thing to give the image a sense of motion. But if you wanted to freeze it, it could be a little bit distracting. So when I went back last time, similar scene, similar kind of flow, but I set up the water exposure for a couple of seconds using kind of fairly traditional settings like f11 to 16, a low ISO, maybe 2 to 4 seconds for this particular type of water motion. But it was very windy, so all these ferns in that particular shot were moving around quite a bit. So the simplest thing I did, I may have stopped up a little bit to f8 or so, and I increased the ISO up to 1600 to take a separate shot for the foliage to make sure it was all still. And at those settings, 1600 ISO in the Canon R5, is still a very clean image. So I don't have any issues going up to higher ISOs, particularly with the some of the newer mirrorless cameras. You can go right up to 1600 pretty well. So this is a kind of shot with dynamic lighting where lighting planning is important and an app like PhotoPills is very useful. This is the top of Marianne Falls in Lamington National Park, and it basically faces due west at the top of the falls. So you'll only get direct sun shining on here for maybe a couple of months of the year, either side of the equinox. And so we went there in March, towards the, I think the latter part of March. So it was getting very close to the equinox. If you went, I've seen a lot of pictures where the sun's out of frame and there's still some direct light, but I think for a dramatic picture like this, I was aiming specifically to get this, and the app helped me plan that. And this is another type of shot where, for instance, if you're bracketing using shutter speed, then you might get all kinds of differing water motion appearances here. If you're shooting at a quarter for the sky and then half and then 1 second for the shadows here, everything's going to look a bit different. So for this type of shot, it's another situation where I would consider doing ISO bracketing instead of shutter speed bracketing. And this is a Marianne Falls taken from South Australia with very poor flow. So there hadn't been much rain around in 2019. And I just want to draw your attention to one of the side effects of shutter speed or traditional bracketing for exposures. And you can see the water motion looking different from here to here to here to here. So that's a side effect of water motion looking different when you're using a shutter speed to bracket. So if I were to shoot that shot again, I'd probably try to shoot it with ISO bracketing so the shutter speed is consistent throughout and I don't end up with that slightly unusual look of the water there. I think a lot of people may not notice it, but it bugs me when I look at it. So that's why in the future I've kind of thought of strategies to overcome this kind of problem. And if you're shooting in canyons, so this is Rocky Creek Canyon or Sheep Dip Canyon in the Blue Mountains. It's very, very dark in there, very, very cold. You need to have everything in a full waterproof sealed bag to go further in that canyon. So there's no way I'm taking this shot handheld, because on the GoPro footage, you can't even watch it because my hands were shaking so much that I really couldn't get any good footage at all. So tripod absolutely necessary, and a tripod necessary for blending here as well. For a very long exposure, I guess it's not so important to use the ISO bracketing, and you can bump out the shutter speed because there's not going to be much difference between a 2, 4 and an 8-second exposure, for instance. So I think this one was shutter speed bracketed rather than ISO bracketed. This is one of my favorite shots of dynamic light from a waterfall setting. It's located in Butte Creek in Oregon, so the Columbia River Gorge. And seasonal variation, there's a shot in their fall, which obviously made for the nice colors of the foliage in the background. But early morning mists made this really magical with the light shining through and lighting up from the waterfall as well. So another scenario where, like, if you had the traditional kind of overcast cloudy day, it would still make for a very nice shot. But this dynamic lighting, I think, just adds something else to it, even though it does add to the difficulty of capturing that. Okay, so we've spoken a little bit about the types of situations you get yourself in. I'm just going to go through some examples of different compositional tools that I use when I'm considering when I'm taking waterfall images. The first thing is that I tend to like maintaining interest through an image. So something maybe captures you in the foreground, something leading to something of interest in the background. And in order to lead through, I like using S-curves for some reason, or Z-lines, sometimes circular things. It's just nice to have curves in an image, in a waterfall image in particular. And what I try to do for any image, and not just waterfalls, is I always try to make sure that the context of the whole scene is there. So ideally, if someone who knows the area sees my picture, I'm really hoping that they can say, I know where you took that from. Or, this is taken from so-and-so, because it's something different about that area as opposed to shooting just a generic, I guess, waterfall kind of scene. I'm not so much, I enjoy looking at abstract waterfall shots where you just have no idea where it might be. But for my style of photography, I generally try to put a regional context into it as well. And because most waterfall shots are in forests, most of the time I'm excluding sky unless it's adding to the context. And the scenarios where I can think where it adds to the context are if you've got open air waterfalls, so beachside waterfalls or mountain waterfalls and so forth. Those are all some specific scenarios where I would consider adding the sky to it. So this is a picture of Manum Falls. So from below, as opposed to the Sunstar image you saw, which was taken from above, during some decent fall several years ago now. And I really like the way the water was making a yin-yang type of appearance. You had to do a bit of imagination what it might be in long exposure, but fortunately that's what it turned out to be. So the key things about this picture to point out is that I tried to frame it pretty tightly. So the top of the waterfall was pretty much at the top of frame. And I think where I've stumbled upon this kind of fill the frame approach is a lot with Tasmanian landscape photography. I've gone over there and I've found that a lot of the images that really appeal to me really fill the frame with full of interest. So that's a style of photography that I've been drawn more to recently, whereas a lot of my previous images have been very open, so clean corners and some space to go into the image. But I have been going more into the fill the frame approach lately as well. This is an image of Marianne's from Hamersley Gorge. This is in Karajini National Park in Western Australia. And I think she composes much better than I do. I didn't see this shot when we were there and I was standing right next to her. So I think this makes really good example of the curve, really interesting foreground curling into the background. And the sky is purposely excluded because if you've been to this spa pool in Hamersley Gorge, you'll know that above it is just really a bit scrubby and not that interesting. And so to add that to the image would really just be a bit of a distraction. And the other thing I like about this image is you can't really tell how big Spa Pool Waterfall is from looking at this picture. It's actually only about 1.5 meters, but it kind of leaves you guessing, and it kind of leaves you guessing about what's up and what's down, which is one of the key elements of the scene. This was taken more recently in a place called Secret Falls in Tasmania. So it's a very short walk near the Cascade Brewery, and it's quite popular because it is a very pretty waterfall. But one thing I wanted to highlight for this is that there's I guess a trend in waterfall photography to introduce artificial lighting, particularly at the top of the image. I find it difficult to do convincingly. And I guess I don't want to mislead people into thinking that that's even a possibility. So I really love shooting waterfalls when there's some lighting from above, particularly when it's subtle. The lighting that was here was light that was breaking through snow showers up higher on the mountain. So it's really nice, subtle kind of 5 p.m. spring, winter light. And you can just see it catching the branches up here and filtering through down here. So with my waterfall processing, I'm trying to think about how to accentuate the natural light rather than introduce light. And as you can see, I'm trying to do a bit of a curve into the background for that, for a composition as well. This is an image of the spout at Liffey Falls. So once again, safety is an issue here. This is very wet rock, so I did have my spikes on here to make sure I didn't just fall off down there. But try to utilize a bit of an S curve as well, or a Z curve, with this spout leading into the background and trying to highlight the areas of interest, including the fern and the branch leading off there. And once again, with my particular preferences in landscape photography, I do try to keep corners clean rather than use them as framing devices. I've seen a lot of photographers use it very effectively, where they frame the image with, say, darker tree silhouettes and so forth, but it's not generally the type of picture that I'm looking for. But if the opportunity presents, I will look for that as well. But generally speaking, clean corners is my modus operandi for most of the shots that I take. So I've broken a couple of my rules for waterfalls here. The first is not including the sky, but Sunwapta Falls in the Rockies is a open waterfall that's amazing to stand and view. And one of the features are the mountains in the background. So I think for this shot, I really wanted to include the wider context of the mountains and a subtle sunset in the background as well. One of my other kind of self-imposed rules for waterfall photography is I try not to let the water's blues overcome the scene as well. But if you've been to those falls, the glacial waters are really kind of this unnatural cyan blue. So I've kind of left that in this particular image just to reflect my memory of the water at the time as well, to contrast with the rest of the scene. This is an image of another secret falls, but this secret falls is in Vancouver Island. It's a narrow slot canyon, and with any slot canyon, just like the Rocky Creek one that I showed before, the main challenge is dynamic range. So it's very dark in this canyon, and beyond it, it's quite bright. Fortunately, this was an overcast day, otherwise the conditions may have been even tougher to handle. But I will admit that a lot of this picture, the mood comes from processing, because all of this stuff here is actually out of the canyon. So it's actually quite bright here. So in the post-processing, I've tried to make it look as though this is from within the canyon and kind of reduce the exposure of this by 1 to 2 stops to still give it a darker appearance. So that is a little bit kind of artificial, but hopefully it's still kind of convincing. And this particular shot, sometimes there's no particular rule that you're adhering to, like there's no curves there, there's no S shape or anything like that. The only vague rule of composition here, I guess, thirds. There's a background foliage there, there's a waterfall, and then there's the empty kind of foreground there. So this is one of the cascades along Tulona Creek. And if you watch out anywhere you're walking along that walk, you'll be able to take shots like this all day. So it's one of these walks where you can spend all day doing it on an overcast, cloudy day. Unfortunately for me, it was shaping to be a very bright day. So I was on a bit of a stopwatch before the sun came over the ridge and really made it difficult to shoot. So when we're talking about waterfalls, my main go-to lens is a wide angle. And I'm using the Canon 14 to 35mm lens at the moment. And 14mm really opens up a can of worms, both positive and negative. So the positive is that you can include so much in the scene, but that's also a negative because it leads to a lot of mess potentially creeping into the composition as well. So if you have a wide scene, it's great for context. You can get what the environment looks like around it, but with forests, particularly scrubby forests like in South Australia, it's very challenging to keep order in your composition. Now, when I'm shooting waterfalls and other landscape genres as well, like seascapes, I don't go by the subscription that lower is better for your perspective. I try to make sure that there's something transitioning from foreground to midground to background. And the risk with going too low is that you might just get this huge foreground and then the background, and you eliminate anything in the midground. Sometimes that works well, but other times it doesn't. And so I try to have at least some height to the image so that there is some transition from foreground to the background. And if you're up very, very close, then focus stacking for interesting foregrounds like, mushrooms and things like that for waterfalls and forests is very appropriate to do. And my main software for blending that is Helicon. So I use Helicon rather than Photoshop because I find it does a much better job of stacking without errors. And a lot of the times for waterfall shots, if there isn't anything really engaging, like the rocks look okay, but they don't look super interesting, or there's no particular piece of foliage or mushrooms or anything like that, then often I find water motion as a good foreground as well, as you may have seen with a lot of the previous pictures. So going through some of these wide angle things. So this is a shot taken from the Otways, where I focus stacked 7 shots for a mushroom that's very close to the lens. And blended that in Helicon seamlessly, despite the relative complexity of it. This is also another shot that's very wide. So this Ingallala Falls in South Australia, and it's a vertorama of 2 15mm images taken with the NiSi F4. I couldn't fit it into the one image. And I guess it's one example of getting the appropriate perspective. I was tempted to kind of shoot really down low here, but then you kind of lose the swirls leading to the fall. So I had to end up raising the tripod just a little bit higher so I could get that kind of flow into the image. So yeah, the height of the camera leading to the resultant perspective, whether you're pointing down or up, is very important in waterfall photography.
Hey, Dylan, can I just ask a quick question back on that?
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of photographers that I see that really start to shoot waterfalls, their first way, I guess the first way they approach it is they usually go up close and push close to the waterfall and shoot it from there. Yeah. And they tend to miss a lot of this foreground element that you've got in your shots. And it's clear looking at shot after shot of yours, your perspective, you really walk back from the waterfall to really look for that foreground. So can you just explain like how, when you go to a waterfall, where you're kind of thinking and how far away you're looking to set up so you've kind of got that perspective with a smaller waterfall with that foreground?
Yeah, look, when I'm approaching a waterfall, most of the time you're approaching from the downstream end. So you've got time to approach it and see what it looks like. So from way back from the waterfall, you can start to see whether or not there might be some longer focal lengths that might suit it from a distance. And then as you're walking, I'm just looking at the environment closely to see what's of interest that might complement the waterfall in the background. The waterfall itself may be a good subject, but I think on its own, I don't find it as engaging as some kind of context in the foreground. Like at Ingallala Falls, where this shot is taken, you don't really get to see the waterfall at all until you're right up against it, because this boulder on the left kind of obscures you as you're walking into the path. So that's really part of the scene. You're standing on a rock here between all of this, and you're seeing a clear view of the waterfall pretty much for the first time as you're walking up to it. So that's the kind of feel I guess I wanted to get from the waterfall. And yeah, so if you listen to, I guess if you think about, well, how am I feeling when I come and see this waterfall, then that might help you with your composition, or it may not. But yes, the other advantage of starting from way back as well is the other, I guess, insurance technique I mentioned of getting some dry shots first. And so making sure your camera's still okay. And then you can get more adventurous and get right up close. There's a second cascade, for instance, at the top of Ingallala that needs a bit of getting to. I've never got a really good shot of it, but I always save that for last because that's where I'm going to get stuff really kind of dirty and whacked and so forth. So maybe with that in mind, for some of the images that I'm going to show, I'll talk a bit about the reasoning for shooting where I did as we go.
Thank you.
Yeah. So this is, I guess, another good example of that. This is Gwongarai Falls. I don't know about the pronunciation, but it's on the Taluna Creek Trail. So you actually approach this waterfall from above it up here, and then you circle around. There's a cauldron up the top, and then you go a fair way downstream, down a pretty much a steep embankment before you climb up upstream to get to this location here. So first, from a technical aspect point of view, when I'm shooting at waterfalls and I'm shooting down, the problem is that things that are vertical splay out. So you might notice that a lot of the waterfalls are placed centrally in the image. So they're not kind of tilting, because I think a tilting waterfall was kind of quite distracting if you've got the camera tilted down. So that's from that point of view. And in terms of the reason why I chose this spot, the splash pool itself from up there really didn't have any features apart from a broken log, which I've excluded. So after wandering up close to the waterfall, I came back and found this nice mossy boulder to shoot from. And actually in the pool behind me, there were some Lamington blue crays. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be lovely if I had a crayfish in the shot? But unfortunately, that wasn't possible. They don't really bask on the rocks. They kind of run the moment you get close. So that's Gwongarai Falls. Now, in terms of, actually, I omitted one slide, and that's the mid-focal length. And so as Andrew was saying, if you walk up to a scene and to your eye, you think, well, that's a great shot, and all I need to do is frame it with my fingers, and that's the shot I want, then I'm usually grabbing the 24-70 and shooting at 50 mils, because that's pretty much a as you see focal length. So that's when I would use a 24-70, when all of a sudden I'm just seeing a scene and I think, look, that looks really great. But longer focal lengths, I think you can use that to great advantage to focus on details. And also, because of the compression of planes, if you've got two objects that are, meters and meters apart, if you stand back far enough, they can look very close. So a person standing on a rock 50 meters in front of a big waterfall can really give a sense of scale to the tiny person with a huge kind of cascades behind it, looking as though it's falling right onto them. Longer focal lengths are often necessary in waterfalls when you just can't get to them. A waterfall that comes to mind in Tasmania is Philosopher Falls. You can only see that from a platform unless you're going to take a real mission to get to its base. So that can be quite hazardous as well. But as with the wider focal length, just because you're shooting long doesn't mean you shouldn't try and include some kind of identifying feature that makes it unique and not just a picture of water. So hopefully the next few examples is an example of that. So this shot is taken at Crater Falls. So this is up from Ronnie Creek on the overland trek on the last trip that we did with the girls. And as you're walking down, it's one of those shots where I looked and I thought, wow, that looks great just to the eye. Unfortunately, I didn't have the 24-70 on me. So I shot that at 70 mils and had to stand a fair bit further back off the boardwalk in order to get this shot. But it's an example of a mid-range focal length shot because it looked just good to the eye. So that's the focal length I went to. This is Punchbowl Falls in the state of Oregon along Eagle Creek. And the reason I shot this at a long focal length, firstly, is because you can't really get up close to Punchbowl Falls unless you're on a raft. And secondly, it was a great combination of waterfall spray, residual mist in the area, as well as bright sunlight, giving rise to those beams. So once again, in a cloudless, overcast day, this would still be a lovely shot. But the fact that there was all this dynamic lighting made it difficult to capture, but still, I think, a more engaging picture reflective of the conditions I was there. On the same trail as Metlaco Falls, and one aspect of getting this shot that I think is a bit underrated is talking to local people. So I met a really good, amazing chap called Tula Top. He's a good waterfall photographer. I'm not sure if he's still photographing or not, but I made contact with him prior to this trip and we did the walk together. And he pointed out this lookout to me where I would have spent a while looking for it because it wasn't signed at the time. I think now, unfortunately, you can't photograph that anymore because the embankment from which I took this at a long focal length has fallen off with the recent storms and fires that were there. So despite this being a fairly long focal length, it's very identifiable as Metlaco Falls, and it's not completely abstract. And obviously you can tell that it's their fall. For those of you who've been there, this is Devil's Punch Bowl Waterfall in New Zealand. And if you've been up to the platform, this tree is actually quite distant. So you may not actually spot this composition. I can't take credit for it because I'd seen pictures of this composition done a few times before. But it's an example of the compression of planes because the waterfall is actually way back from that tree. And I left it slightly out of focus just to give that slight impression that what's going on, and experimented with shutter speeds. This was a very dark and rainy day. So I think I ended up, in order to get a fast enough shutter speed to freeze that water motion, I think I needed to get to an ISO of about 800 or so in order to capture that. For those of you who come from Tassie or Northwest Tassie in particular, this is Dip Falls. And the main feature of Dip Falls is the columnar basalt that it falls through. It's a very extensive and big waterfall that was in very full flow when I was there, and very difficult to capture because it was in bright sunlight and other parts of it were in full shade. So I did take some wide angle shots of it, but I think in the end I went for a more detailed approach, trying to capture, I guess, the essence of what makes Dip Falls special, which is all these mini cascades that happen along its course. So shutter speed tips. For waterfalls, I think that longer isn't always better, and it's always good to know what kind of shutter speed you're planning to take before you actually set up the camera to do so. So a lot of time, if you want to get the sense of smoothing out of the water, but yet retain some texture, about 0.5 of a second is where I'm aiming for a lot of these shots. However, a lot of the shots, in order to maintain a lowish ISO and a good aperture to maintain depth of field, you end up shooting for 1 to 5 seconds, and that smooths out the water quite a bit. And I think that for me, I tend to take a lot of shots in that 1 to 5 second range. I tend not to take so many shots of 5 to 30 seconds these days or longer, because that gives completely kind of textureless water, which may be desired, but it's something I was doing a while ago, but I'm veering more towards shorter shutter speeds now for waterfall photography. And I also take separate shutter speeds at differing ISOs for freezing the foliage, because I do find blurry foliage on the whole a little bit distracting. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So on the appearance of water or texture, I just thought I'd bring up one of my main tenets, I guess, of landscape photography in general when I'm shooting, and that's contrast. So I tend to think of the 3 T's in contrast. So the first is tone. So that's bright and dark. So that's traditionally what we think of contrast. The second aspect of contrast I think of is temperature. And so I like to have areas, for instance, bright areas that are warmer, dark areas that are cooler. So you've got a warm, cool kind of contrast in the image. And the last T of contrast that I like to think about is textural contrast. So there's no better environment to do this than for waterfall photography, because you're often in a busy forest, lots of rocks, lots of trees. You can have a lot of textures there. And then to contrast that high texture part of the scene, that's why I try to get a smoothish looking water appearance to give the contrast, to make that sing in contrast to the foliage and so forth. So the 3 T's of contrast for landscape photography is what I'm constantly thinking when I'm doing this in post-processing as well as shooting. So just that's that same picture there. So the textural contrast is a lot of sharpening in this tree and not much in the background. And obviously total contrast, not a lot of temperature contrast there. So that's a fast shutter speed to freeze all that. So I think it was about 1 in 200 or so. So the 0.5 second shutter speed range, so it looks smooth, particularly when you've got objects, very fast moving water like this waterfall in Vanuatu called Lunil Waterfall. And in the foreground, even though it's smoothed out, you can still see some streaks. So that's the typical appearance of about a 0.5 second exposure, where you can still see some texture in the water. And if you apply sharpening to it, it actually picks up something to sharpen. As opposed to this image, which is of Sandcut Falls in Vancouver Island's west coast. Now, this is an image where using an app like PhotoPills can be highly beneficial. So the dawn was slightly left of this. So it was lining up the waterfall and the sky. And importantly, the clouds were rushing towards me. So using a weather app to know which direction the clouds are coming to point the camera so you get that zooming appearance in a long exposure is always useful. And in terms of the waterfall itself, I really wanted to make this image a real surreal image, so kind of as textureless as possible throughout most of the image, save for the beach and the rocks. So this was a shot that was taken with a 6-stop ND filter, which I rarely use for waterfalls. And I also used a GND for this picture, being an open air image. And because there's a flat horizon, I used a hard stop GND for this particular image in combination with the polarizer. So that's a bit of an exception to the rule in terms of my waterfall shooting these days, but you just adapt to the scene and go for whatever you think works at the time. So in terms of ISO tips, I mentioned before the concept of ISO bracketing. I'm not going to budge any rules, but obviously the lower the better because it's cleaner. But with a lot of the mirrorless cameras these days, as I mentioned, ISOs up to 1600, even 3200 are pretty usable. I think that using ISO, particularly it goes down to 50, it avoids you needing to use ND filters in order to get your 0.5 second shutter speeds and so forth. So use the low ISOs in combination with small apertures in order to achieve that. So for this particular image, it's taken on the west coast of New Zealand, North Island, the White Cliffs Walkway. And it's a bit of a precarious situation because if you can't tell what you're looking at, it's the cliff face with a receding tide. So the tide's actually right up against the cliff. So it's kind of a no escape territory. So I was in waders there and had a bit of an escape route planned, a couple of 100 meters down the beach. But in order to get this appearance, there was a waterfall flowing down. And the waterfall actually was not making any flow at all because it was pretty small, as you can see. So all that water motion is actually waves having hit the cliff and receding back. So I was watching for a bit and I thought about 0.5 a second is about what I need to get that kind of appearance. But it was pretty dark. I didn't need a huge depth of field. So I think the settings for this shot were f8 and ISO 400 and half a second or so. So my waterfall photography for shutter speed tends to drive the other settings within an acceptable depth of field and an acceptable ISO. And this shot's probably an example of that. This shot is of Liffey Falls, taken on the last trip. In challenging conditions, pretty much bright sunshine, but fortunately a lot of Liffey forest covers it. So my approach to this scene is actually quite complex, maybe slightly more complex than it looks, but I basically exposed the water for 0.5 second at ISO 50. And so the rest of the scene was very dark. And then I took several shots at ISO 100 and 200 and blended them all to get the adequate exposure. But the other complicating factor is I really wanted a reflection of the falls and the sky. And so I needed to take another set of shots with the CPL effect turned on to reduce the reflections of the rocks and improve the foliage. And then I turned the CPL in another orientation so that this wasn't riverbed and was pure reflection. So there's a lot of shots taken into this, I guess, seemingly simple looking shot, but the main aspects of this were appropriate CPL use for the effect that you want and ISO bracketing rather than shutter speed bracketing. Because I think if I'd gone to 1 and 2 seconds for these darker exposures, the water probably would have looked quite different in this part of the image as opposed to in the bright light. So in terms of filter tips, as I said, a lot of the waterfall trips I do, I just bring the wide angle, I bring a CPL and cleaning stuff, and that's about it. So a GND is generally avoided, particularly in forest, because you don't want the trees turning dark halfway up and so forth. But there are situations where you use it for open air. And when you do use ND filters, or when I use ND filters, it's rare that I go above a 3-stop. Sometimes a 6-stop or a 10-stop is used if I'm shooting in bright daylight. And I'll show you some examples. So this is an example of the CPL effect. So I'll take you through each of the images. So the top left here, this is Morialta Third Falls in Adelaide. This is with no CPL at all at a certain exposure. And if I take away 1 stop, that's what it looks like. So the CPL actually acts as a 1-stop ND filter, even when you're not having it turned or anything like that. So you can see with the CPL turned on, all this bright glary stuff becomes natural rock color. So these files have had nothing done to them. they're direct raw exports. But if you turn the CPL the other direction, or in the wrong orientation, then all this reflection and glare comes back. So the key message for this is, even when you've got the CPL on, make sure that it's in the right orientation. Just having it on will not give you the desired effect necessarily. And one of the major traps is if you change orientation of your shot, you want to take a landscape shot and you just change the portrait, make sure you change the orientation of the CPL as well. Otherwise, you might end up with an inadvertently glary shot again. So this is a shot of Hopetown Falls in the Otways. And so most of this shot was taken for the CPL to reduce the glare off the ferns and get some see-through into the waterbed. But I also took a separate shot with the CPL in another orientation so I could actually get a reflection of Hopetown Falls, and then kind of blended that into the scene as well. So that's another example where I've used the CPL in different orientations for a blend. This is a bit of a complex one. So this is Natural Bridge in Queensland. It's a panorama of several shots. And I really wanted to get the smooth water everywhere through the image to contrast with the texture and the rock and the forest beyond. So for each frame, I used a 3-stop ND filter to get the water motion right. And then basically, because the water duration was several seconds. So if I bracketed for shutter speed or ISO with the ND filter on, I would have ended up needing to spend like a minute or two for each frame, which is, I guess, not very practical. So if you have a firm locking on your tripod, what I did for this shot was I took a frame with the ND filter off, then unclipped the filter, took another shot without the filter kit on, and then moved on to the next frame, clipped the filter back on, took the filter off, and so forth. So it's a bit of a cumbersome way to do it, but it was better than, I guess, spending 5 minutes per frame on each shot. And I guess this is an example where I've used a 6-stop ND in the middle of the day in order to get a 1 to 2 second exposure. So this is an alligator gorge, which is never usually flowing even this much, even though it doesn't look like much. But it's the runoff from the Flinders Ranges was tremendous last spring after about a week of heavy rains. So this is a site that's not seen very often. And I think if you're a local, you might appreciate the context of this shot, because it's usually much drier than that. And I think we've already gone through the principles of this shot with a 6-stop ND filter. All right, so I'm going to move on and give some tips about processing and go through some pictures to hopefully, I guess, highlight the details on that. The first is that highlights being blown in water are sometimes inevitable when it's very, very bright and so forth. But generally speaking, I try to take multiple exposures, either shutter speed or ISO bracketing, in order to get some kind of texture, even in the bright parts of the water. For waterfall images, in order to get that kind of dreamy appearance, I think there's a tendency to make sure there's no blacks whatsoever. But I think sometimes some pure blacks in an image can make for good negative space as well. So you can have some blacks, and I don't think that's a problem. So I resist pushing the shadow bar up to 100 for every image, for instance. I'm going to give an example of what nuclear greens look like. That's a really kind of toxic green. And at the end of that, I've got a picture in Photoshop where I can just show you a very simple way to avoid that kind of really toxic radioactive looking green in the pictures, because that's not usually a natural kind of appearance that you see. And as I mentioned before, I also try and avoid overpowering blues in the water by desaturating blue, if that's how it turns out, by contrasted appearance and so forth. Now, when you're sharpening pictures with waterfalls, then there's a lot of texture in rocks and a lot of fine detail in leaves and twigs and so forth. There's a potential for sharpening artifact to creep in. And the way I kind of avoid this is to make sure that the sharpening is applied, but not to the very bright parts of the image. So I might use luminosity masks on the sharpening layer to not include the very brights of the image, or blend if, anything that excludes the highlight part of sharpening to apply to that part of the image. In terms of processing as well, I guess I'm thinking, what am I trying to bring out? Am I trying to bring out the massive ferns that are framing the waterfall, and that's the feature of it? Or am I trying to bring out the waterfall itself? So that's the question. And I think the best way to bring that out is through the manipulation of contrast and lighting, so dodging and burning and so forth, and appropriate use of vignetting. Once again, I don't vignette every shot, but for some images it does work. And for those of you who don't know about what Orton effect is, Orton effect is a popular tool used in landscape photography where you introduce a blur to a scene and also make it look much more bright and contrasty. So it looks kind of quite dreamlike, as if you've kind of blown condensation onto a lens and overexposed it. So that's kind of what an Orton effect looks like. And I guess once you've learned it, there's a tendency to apply it to every image and to all of the image. But I think that Orton is a useful effect, but only in selective areas of the image. So if you've got an area that is texture overloaded, I find that's a good spot to apply Orton to soften it down a little bit. And at the top of image where there's natural lighting as well, to accentuate the natural lighting, the use of the Orton effect can be used quite well in order to do that rather than painting in the light itself. And as a personal choice, I resist trying to create artificial sources of lighting. Mainly because, well, I think the main reason is I'm not very good at it. It never looks convincing to me. But the second reason is that it could potentially be misleading if someone goes there and is expecting, lighting and so forth, and it's in a deep canyon or something like that. I don't think that's not the end of the world, but it would be nice to not mislead people. So I'm going to go through some extreme post-processing things that I've done in the past, or extreme as I've gone. And this shot, I hope, is of Marianne Falls. And I hope that, or the hope was that by processing in this way, it made you think, did I just do a reflection or not? And I just wanted to get people thinking a little bit about what had happened. So it's doubly reflected, but it's not really reflected in the middle and so forth. This is just a bit of a fun exercise because if you've been to Marianne's, you know there are a lot of fallen trees. And I really got the feeling that I was inside this kind of temple, I suppose. So I wanted to create this image to look as though there was this temple from both sides rather than one side. Not sure if I was effective with that at all, but it was a fun one to create. This is another image of Marianne Falls, where once again I've gone for a bit of not a straightforward reflection. So I've kept the banks on each side as are, but I've reflected segments of the water to make this kind of keyhole shape. So just for fun, I think if you're good at doing manipulations like this, you can also find applications to use them in normal processing as well, particularly complex selections and so forth. So I don't usually put these images up for competitions or up on our print site and so forth, but they're very fun to do and they also help you develop skills as well. So I think even if you don't do a lot of creative photography, it's good to delve into it just to work on your skills for Photoshop. Now, one of the tips I said earlier was to think about whether or not you're focusing on the waterfall or the environment itself. So this shot was taken at Waterfalls, which is actually just 20 minutes out from the Adelaide CBD. And the main aspect of this shot was really to focus the canyon that this waterfall goes through, and also the amazing sunset lighting through wild weather that was hitting the distant cliffs as well. So the waterfall is really just I guess a compositional tool in this image to zigzag your way through to the beautiful lighting in the background while highlighting all the light hitting on the cliffs here. So it's an example where the waterfall doesn't need to take I guess the primary focus of the image. In terms of post-processing, this looks suspiciously like a bit of light painting because it is, but I find it once again much easier to do convincing light painting when there's actually light there. Like for instance, I find it very difficult to manufacture light like that on a tree, but because it's already there, I can just accentuate it. This is an image of a waterfall called Monomeath Falls, which is in the Otways, and it's on private property, so you have to stay at the property in order to access it legally. And it's an example of focusing on the waterfall itself. There's a lot of really lush environment around, but I think in this particular scene, I've gone for the textural contrast to make sure that there's not a lot of texture here to distract yourself from the waterfall, and the waterfall becomes the prime focus of interest. And there's a heavier than usual vignette here that I've used as well for this image, as well as the natural kind of framing of this circle that is created by nature, really. Top-down perspectives of waterfalls are interesting. They're quite challenging to shoot, but I enjoy them. And I usually try to shoot them when there's something remarkable in the distance. So in this case, this is shot at Congram Falls, which is slightly upstream from Hopetown Falls. It takes a little bit of going through scrub to get to this particular perspective. But it is a beautiful waterfall. And the most striking thing, which I hope that this image confirms, is like there's almost like this advancing army of giant ferns at the bottom. And that was the impression I got while I was standing up there. And hopefully that's the impression that you get from looking at this particular image. So once again, the waterfall is just a leading to the main subject in this particular image. So this image I shot because even though, you know, red water is not necessarily an appealing thing, it's such an ephemeral phenomenon in the Flinders Ranges that I think it was good to capture just for that reason alone. So it had been raining very solidly. And this is the trek to Blinman Pools, which is a 10K return track. And it's usually completely dry. So there was this much water flowing, and in the early hours after a decent amount of rainfall, it picks up all the surrounding dust. So you get this amazing kind of red river running through the scene. And so I've tried to do the 3 T's of contrast here, with the tonal contrast, the temperature contrast between the warm and then the cooler rocks that I've made cooler in post-processing, and then the texture. So there's no sharpening applied to all of this at all. And there's more than usual sharpening applied to the rocks around there. And oops, as a compositional tool as well, just scrubby stuff at the top. So I've excluded it by not having any sky in the composition as well. So kind of filling the frame as much as possible. This is the same scene of Punchbowl Falls, and a couple of principles here as well. This is shot obviously at a wider focal length than the previous shot, which is really just framed around here with a 70 to 200. And as I was discussing before, the advantage of using a wider focal length is you get the bigger context of a scene in. And I don't usually move stuff around the environment, but Tula, who I was photographing with, was photographing a naturally fallen leaf on a rock next to me, and I didn't want to disturb him, so I grabbed a leaf and put it on this rock and shot it with a focus stack for a longer distance. But you can see how there is a risk that when you shoot very wide with distant objects that it can become quite minimized. But I hope I've tried to overcome this by having a slightly raised perspective. So there's mid-ground appearance of all this reflected light leading to the background. If I shot this very low, you would have just got rock with leaf straight into waterfall, which I think may not have worked as well as having the lead in with a slightly higher perspective. This is a shot of Vera Falls, or Vera Creek Falls, which is along the Frenchman's Cap Trail in Tasmania. And it's another example of trying to shoot for this natural lighting in the background. And in terms of post-processing, that's where I would use an Orton effect in the background to accentuate the light and also minimize the potential artifact and grunginess from the sharpening of all that detail that's there as well. So that's I guess, the use of Orton there. And while when we're talking about greens and toxic greens, that's probably, in retrospect, that's as close to kind of toxic green as I would have in my images normally. And the way I combat this is actually by using selective color in Photoshop and adjusting the yellows rather than the greens. So the reason why this green has this appearance is there's too much cyan in it, and there's probably too much green in it. So the simple thing to do is to move the cyan red slider slightly towards red and move the magenta green slider slightly towards magenta, taking care not to go too far. Otherwise, magenta looking moss isn't very good either. Similar kind of appearance as well for this one, shot taken in Fiji. The lighting in the background was natural, and a good, or I think a reasonable use of Orton effect to give that kind of glowy appearance in the background while contrasting with all the textures around in the rocks. This is a really challenging shot. So this is taken at Natural Springs. I think it would have worked better if there were more glowworms. I'm not a big fan of the shot, but I just thought I'd show it in terms of extremes for exposure blending. So the full moon was coming in through, or not full moon, probably about a half moon was coming in through the natural bridge. So there was I took a long exposure for that part of the scene. But if you ever shot glowworms before, you're needing to shoot at about, say, 6400 ISO for a few minutes in order for them to appear like that. So this is an extreme kind of exposure blend that really required a lot of judging of trial and error in order to get them right at the scene, and a lot of noise reduction as well afterwards in order to achieve that in post-processing. So this is a shot of Hancock Gorge in Karajini, and there's another technique in post-processing that I'll talk about now as well, and that is when you're using a wide angle and you've got reflective surfaces everywhere, it's rare that the polarization effect will affect the whole scene. So for this particular shot, like if I had the polarizer optimized for here, there might be glare up there and vice versa. So this is another example where I've taken a couple of a couple of frames where the polarizers in slightly different positions to make sure that I've captured everywhere with minimal glare, essentially. And then when you're post-processing, it's pretty much simple as putting the two layers on top of each other and having the top layer in darken mode so that you've got all the darker parts of the image and the brighter parts kind of excluded. And a tripod is essential for that because you need to have the images lined up. This is another shot of, this is a shot I took of Spa Pool. I much prefer Marianne's. But the main aspects here, I'm just going to say again, was the temperature contrast. So there is a natural temperature contrast between the rock there, between warm on one side and cool on the other, which I've accentuated in this picture. I've tried to do a lot of textural enhancement on the rocks while leaving no sharpening at all with the water to give that textural contrast, and then the tonal contrast I've tried to achieve with light and dark sections of the image. So that's the key kind of processing tips as well for achieving contrast in image. And I just wanted to bring this image up because I had heard about doing long exposures without ND filters by just taking lots and lots of exposures and using what's called the average method. And that works if you want to have everything just completely flat out. But if you want to get a specific swirl pattern, for instance, that doesn't work. The average method would work to make this completely white, but it does not retain, for instance, a particular pattern that is dependent on a specific duration. So this was about a 10-second exposure required to get these swirls. And when I blended a few of the 10-second exposures together, I thought, well, maybe you get a nicer looking circle, but you didn't. You just get a mess and it all ends up being white the more you blend together. So the average method is good for getting kind of completely textureless scenes, but it's not good for getting specific patterns of water. And I'm almost at the end now, so any questions that come along, but this is Bastion Cascade. This is probably the girls' favorite walk from the trip and one of mine as well. And the key here as well is, once again, trying to enhance the texture, trying to keep the greens under control because they're out of control in nature itself. So there's a tendency to want to do that in post-processing. But in the Bastion Cascades area, there's so much more to photograph than just these cascades. And I thought I'd finish up on this fall called Gossamer Falls, which is just around the area. And it's a really pretty waterfall to photograph that highlights a lot of the points that we've been talking about in terms of technique, composition, and so forth. So if I were to summarize what we've spoken about today before we take questions, I think planning for your waterfall adventure with the appropriate tools is a useful thing to do, but I think you just go along for the walk as well and you enjoy it. And as long as you're happy being in nature without necessarily coming back with photos, it's going to be a win-win situation no matter what you do. If you are very set on taking photos though, make sure you've got gear and the mindset to be able to take it in any type of weather or lighting condition, and make sure you have the bare minimum, I'd say, would be a CPL, a tripod, and a camera, and a willingness to get wet. And consider different technical aspects that we've spoken about today, including ISO bracketing and so forth. and process in a way that is kind of distraction free, and should be 3 T's of contrast, sorry. And just enjoy the waterfall itself, and over and above everything else, make sure you don't go breaking bones or getting yourself lost and so forth, and be prepared for the adventure and enjoy it and make it part of life. So that concludes my bit, and I guess I'm happy to take any questions about the images or some of the stuff I brought up.
Thank you so much, Dylan. That was fantastic. And I really loved hearing about the contrast where you look at temperature, textural, as well as tonal. That was very interesting to me. And I can see that in your images 100% when you actually point that out. So I found that exceptionally interesting. Thank you.
No worries.
There was a couple of questions in chat, and then we'll invite people if they want to ask live to jump on and ask a question.
Yeah.
Dylan, one question was, how do you know when the CPL is orientated correctly or in the right position?
Yeah, so if you have a camera with live view and you've got the histogram on, as a rule of thumb, if you've got the CPL in the correct orientation to reduce glare, that'll be when the CPL moves most to the left towards the shadow. So it's a darker kind of exposure than if it were in the wrong orientation. So that's one method. The other one's the eye test as well. Like, pick an area of the image that's bright and green. And if you turn the or pick an area of rock that's glaringly bright, and when you turn the CPL, it's in the right orientation when that rock turns dark and you can see its natural color, or when that foliage is at its brightest green as well. The other way you can do it is that some brands of polarizer have a marker, like they have a divot to point out where the plane of polarization is maximal. And so for polarization, the maximal polarization, if you're pointing towards the light source, is where your thumb rotates. So if you can imagine, if you got as a basic rule of thumb, if you've got one of those polarizers, that marker should be pointing up, because if that's the light source, then all around you at the bottom is maximal polarized. So yeah, very few brands have that, but I have had brands in the past where that makes it super easy. You just point that marker up no matter what orientation you're in, and that's the right orientation.
Cool. And our square polarizers actually pretty much work like that. As long as they're placed in the filter holder with the name at the top, you're at maximum polarization. So,
yeah, so that's the principle, yeah.
Yeah. ISO bracketing you mentioned, there was a lot of comments about. Very interesting, obviously, to keep that shutter speed constant throughout the bracketed images. Do you use the camera's function to do that, or do you just do it manually?
I do it manually. It's fortunate, for instance, on the R5 that, like I think a lot of the Sonys as well, the ISO adjustment is on a separate wheel. So it's very easy. It's just like manually adjusting your shutter speed. It might be slightly more complex even on old Canons, because you need to press another button to adjust ISO and so forth. So you may not be able to get it as quickly. But on most cameras these days, you can probably set it up so one of the wheels adjusts ISO, just like aperture and shutter speed. And I don't know if you can set it up automatically. Actually, I've never checked.
Some cameras do have ISO bracketing, so yeah, you definitely can. Do you typically do? Obviously, it's based on the scene you're shooting and how much dynamic range there is. But do you normally do 2 stops under, 2 stops over, or 1 stop, or what are you typically shooting?
I usually, it depends on what I'm seeing on live view, but generally speaking, if I start off as my darkest exposure at ISO 50, I very rarely have to go past 200. So that's only kind of 1 stop either way, but sometimes I might have to go up to 400 or so. It's rare that I've had to ISO bracket from 50 right up to 800 though, for instance. Which is the 2 stops either way.
Yeah. Well, anyone, if you want to jump on and ask a question, please jump on now.
No questions.
Any questions?
I think you explained it all too well.
Well, that's good to hear.
You may not be seeing it, Dylan, but there's lots of people saying thank you very much and great presentation in the chat as well.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Well, maybe I should stop screen sharing and see if there's anything in there. Yeah.
I've got a question.
Yep, sure.
Hello, mate.
Hey, Brett.
There you go.
Hey, Dylan.
Yep.
Just one thing in terms of your like yellow and greens, because
Yep.
pretty much in every waterfall image, the most dominant colours are yellow and greens.
Yep.
Your yellows and greens just kind of almost, I don't know how you explain it. They just really work well together. It's almost like there's not a big difference between the yellows and greens in terms of tonality.
Yeah.
So I know you've talked before about like the luminance and the hues and so forth in those colours. So can you explain your yellows and greens and also your colour temperature space when you're shooting waterfalls? So do you just shoot on auto white? There's about 5 questions in one here, but the first one is you just shoot on auto white balance, or because your processing tends to probably lean more towards the cooler side. And then you can see there's some sort of, I guess, there's some manipulation in those yellows and greens in terms of like the hues and the luminance and that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, the first question is, yes, I do shoot auto white balance and in RAW, and I just adjust on the RAW file to a base kind of temperature that I think is most appropriate to start off with. Do you want me to share screen on Photoshop just to quickly show you?
That'd be great. I'm sure people would love to see that.
So this one here. So can you see Photoshop? Yep. Okay. So this is a picture of Bastion Cascades. So the greens are pretty, I guess, homogeneous there. You might be able to see, for instance, I've got this panel of actions here where I've got forest greens, I've got green denuke, which basically to reduce the greens and so forth. But the main principle, I might just move this over here, is that I'm just going to show you the effect of the selective color adjustment layer. That's what I mainly use to manipulate the greens and the yellows. So selective color, and mainly it's the yellows, funny enough, rather than greens. And to get the toxic appearance, you just put in lots of cyans, and you put in lots of greens. Lots of greens. So that's what gives you that kind of really toxic green appearance. So if you have that appearance in your picture, then you do the opposite. So you push the magenta slider slightly positive and you push the cyan negative. So until you get something that you kind of is passable throughout. And similarly, if you can do the same to the greens channel as well. But in my kind of forest greens thing, for the yellows, I'm often making the yellows a bit more yellow. So they're a bit warmer than the rest of the scene, and probably a little bit on the green side as well, and removing some of the cyan. So that's generally how I get the green appearance that I have in the images. And I don't apply it to the whole image. So for instance, in this image here that was not processed, there was a patch here that was really kind of toxic green. So I applied that more to this particular patch and so forth. So that's how the images, I like the forest images where the greens are kind of more homogeneous than not. Apart from where it works, where I think up here, for instance, it's a bit more yellow than the rest of the scene. So yeah, it's just masking of that effect of reducing the toxic greens in the image is how I go about that.
Yeah. And then Dylan, obviously you're then making sure that that's having no effect on the water. You're masking the water.
Yes,
otherwise,
that's right.
Yeah, the water's changing temperature or color.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So it's all selective adjustments to the image.
Yeah.
And so for this particular image as well, for the textural contrast, I really wanted to get the fine detail of the moss out. So I'm really only sharpening to any great extent all of this stuff here. And I'm avoiding sharpening all of this stuff up here, which is a bit distracting and not quite as nice. And applying Orton, for instance, to stuff up here. So that's the kind of approach in practice to what I would be doing.
How are you doing the Orton? Is that just Gaussian blur and then levels or something like that?
Yeah, so I make a smart object layer, and in that smart object layer, there's the Gaussian blur, so I can adjust the degree of that. And then there's also levels in that as well, so I can adjust the levels of there. And so with that layer, I very rarely go above, 15-20% opacity with that.
Yeah.
Mm. And Dylan, it's very interesting too. I think some people would have picked up on this. The way you process is almost like how a painter paints an image. So you're looking at the bits of the image that you really want people to take notice of and really stand out. And you're applying sharpening to that. So there is those texture differences or tonal differences to really lead the person around your image. So I think it's very interesting.
Yeah. And funny enough, even though I don't like canvas as a medium, when you print on canvas, if you do that kind of sharpening differential, it really stands out on that medium for some reason, I found.
Interesting. Any other questions? Please feel free to jump on and ask. Dylan, I've got one. What's the most crazy waterfall you've photographed in terms of, I guess, getting to and just the conditions when you were there?
Well, I mean, the first video I showed you, I couldn't take a shot there at Montezuma Falls. The other most crazy one would be Eland Falls. So Eland Falls is on the trek from the Divide in New Zealand. It's the part of the Rootburn track to Lake Mackenzie, and it was raining the whole day there. And so there's a wet weather bypass bridge that is downstream from there. So the conditions at those falls were impossible to shoot as well. And I could only get a shot from downstream from there. So yeah, they're probably the two craziest where, stepping out into those directly in front of the waterfall got me soaked within a second, and I retreated defeated. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions?
No, I think I'm done. I think it's very enjoyable and very much appreciated from Dylan and from NiSi himself. So thank you.
All right. Thanks very much for your time, everyone.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Dylan, for joining us tonight and sharing. As you can see in chat, many people enjoyed tonight, and I know there's going to be quite a few people watching it again just to pick up on some of those smaller detail things that you spoke about, and interesting bits of advice where people can really take it and improve their images. So I think people have learned a lot tonight. So thank you very much for your time. And if you do want to watch this again, it'll be available on our YouTube channel. You can also check out Dylan's YouTube channel. He's got heaps of tutorials and information and stories on different trips he's been on. So that's a great resource to check out as well. And I really encourage you to go to Dylan's blog. He's got some great stories about his trips there as well. They're a great read, and you really get to just scroll through some amazing images and really get a sense of not just the waterfall images Dylan has taken, but all of the images and of all different locations. And there's some absolute crackers there. So definitely go and enjoy that. Just a reminder too about the 15% off. So if you want to jump on to nisifilters.com.au and take advantage of that, the code is live15Dylan. So I think that finishes us off tonight. So again, thank you so much, Dylan. Really appreciate it.
No worries. Great to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alan, for joining us again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Phil.